On a bitter February morning in 1511, the bitter chill outside Richmond Palace did little to reflect the warmth and triumph pulsing through its walls. Inside, the most powerful man in England, King Henry VIII, held his infant son in his arms, weeping tears of joy. That child, Prince Henry Tudor, Duke of Cornwall, represented more than the continuation of a royal bloodline. He symbolized the survival of a fragile dynasty still haunted by the ghost of civil war and rebellion. Just 19 years old, Henry VIII had ascended the throne in 1509 with vigor, ambition, and the fiery idealism of youth. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish princess and widow of his deceased brother, had cemented an international alliance with Spain and bolstered the image of a strong, legitimate monarchy. But for all his strength, Henry's reign teetered on the edge of instability, for power in Tudor England was not truly secure without a male heir. Memories of the bloody Wars of the Roses still lingered in the minds of nobles and commoners alike. The Tudor claim to the throne, founded more on conquest and marriage than ancient nobility, needed the strength of an unbroken male lineage to survive. The birth of Prince Henry on January 1, 1511, seemed to answer every desperate prayer and political calculation. The kingdom erupted in joy. Church bells rang in London for 3 straight days. Bonfires blazed on hillsides across the realm. Foreign ambassadors rushed to send gifts to curry favor with a king now secure in his legacy. The prince's baptism, held with astonishing pomp, drew dignitaries from across Europe. France, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, all watched closely, for this tiny child now played a part in the great chessboard of continental politics. The boy was declared healthy and strong. His cries echoed confidently through the sacred halls of Richmond. Henry VIII, overwhelmed with joy, personally designed a tournament in celebration. Tapestries were woven, dishes prepared, trumpets sounded. For a moment, the future looked golden. But history is never as kind as hope. Behind the smiles, the songs, and the feasts, danger still lurked. Infant mortality was a grim reality in Tudor England. 1 in 3 children died before reaching their first birthday. The royal household, despite its opulence, relied on physicians steeped in superstition and medieval remedies. Bloodletting, charms, prayers, and crude herbal concoctions were the limits of their medical arsenal. As the weeks passed, Prince Henry's condition, once promising, began to change. The child, once so vocal and vigorous, grew quiet. His feeding grew erratic. His skin, pale and cold. Physicians whispered their worries. Courtiers noticed the Queen's face drawn with worry. And by February, just 7 weeks after the world celebrated his birth, the cries of England's hope were silenced forever. Prince Henry Tudor, Duke of Cornwall, heir to the throne of England, died in his royal cradle, leaving behind devastation in the hearts of his parents, and an empire poised for calamity. What followed his death would not be mere mourning. It would be transformation. This was not just the end of a life. It was the first crack in the foundation of the Tudor state. The death of this child would become the catalyst for Henry VIII's descent into obsession, paranoia, and brutality. From that cradle of death would rise divorce, excommunication, religious reformation, and the execution of queens. The boy who never lived to speak a word would spark a silence that screamed through generations. The death of Prince Henry Tudor cast a long and terrible shadow across the court of England. From the festive echoes of January's joy, the halls of Richmond Palace fell into silence. The tapestries that had once fluttered with pride were now drawn in mourning. Black cloth replaced gold. Candlelight flickered not in celebration, but in solemn remembrance. Henry VIII, whose joy had once brought tears to his eyes, now walked the corridors hollow and furious. His grief was not quiet. It was raging, burning with a desperation that would shape the rest of his reign. He had held the promise of eternity in his arms. His son, his legacy, his future, and now, nothing remained but memory. But it was Catherine of Aragon who bore the heaviest burden. For in Tudor England, when a child died, it was not medicine that was blamed, it was the mother. Though she had fulfilled her duty in the eyes of kings and priests, Catherine now felt the weight of an entire kingdom's expectation press against her chest. Rumors swirled, whispered behind veils and fanned by foreign envoys. Was her age to blame? Was God punishing the union between brothers, widow and king? Her melancholy deepened into a sorrow that bordered on despair. Though Henry would outwardly stand by her, cracks began to form in the foundation of their union. His eyes turned toward heaven in anger and toward other women in temptation. And while courtiers tried to carry on, a cold dread settled over the realm. The death of the prince had done more than extinguish a life, it had reignited fear. The same fear that had haunted Henry VII now whispered into the ears of his son. What if the Tudors were never meant to last? With no heir, the specter of civil war returned to the throne room. Every noble house harbored ambitions. Every distant cousin of royal blood became a potential rival. The Yorkist threat, once thought buried with Perkin Warbeck, stirred again in the minds of wary advisors. Henry VIII began to see enemies where none existed and doubted the loyalty of even his most trusted allies. His court, once open and jubilant, grew cautious and cold. Portraits of the dead prince were removed from public view. The golden cradle once placed at the head of the nursery was dismantled and burned. Only the most devout remained at Catherine's side, praying for another miracle, another pregnancy, another chance to save the dynasty. Henry, meanwhile, threw himself into statecraft and showmanship. He expanded England's naval power. He played the peacemaker between warring European nations. He fought wars against France and Scotland, all while keeping one eye fixed on the possibility of a new heir. Catherine became pregnant again, several times. But each time, either the child was stillborn, or the infant died in infancy. The cycle repeated like a curse. Hope followed by mourning, joy chased by silence. By the time their daughter Mary was born in 1516, even that spark of life felt dimmed by the ghosts of her siblings. A girl could not inherit England, not without war. The law and the customs were clear. A queen regnant invited invasion, sedition, civil unrest. Mary's birth delayed Henry's desperation, but it did not cure it. Every year that passed without a son brought new pressure. Foreign ambassadors reported back to Rome and Madrid on Henry's growing frustration. The Spanish crown began to reconsider the strength of their alliance. And in England, whispers of annulment and divorce began to stir among the educated classes. The university men, the clerics, and the ambitious all saw what Henry now dreamed of in silence: the possibility of another wife, another womb, another son. But to leave Catherine, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, and to the Emperor Charles V, required more than political will, it required a break with God himself. And so the long road to Reformation began, not in the mind of a theologian, but in the heart of a grieving father. All of this, the slow erosion of Catherine's place at court, the rise of Anne Boleyn, the challenge to papal supremacy, can be traced to that February morning in 1511 when a tiny heart stopped beating. For had Prince Henry survived, there would be no question of succession. No need for annulment, no split with Rome, no execution of queens. The fate of Thomas More, of Anne Boleyn, of the monasteries, and even of the Church of England itself was sealed by that infant's final breath. The people did not yet know it, but their world had begun to change. From the silence of the cradle rose the thunder of revolution. As the 1520s dawned, the specter of Prince Henry Tudor's death continued to haunt the English court, not as a ghost in the shadows but as a glaring absence at the center of the kingdom's future. Henry VIII, once so filled with youthful idealism, had become increasingly consumed by a singular obsession: siring a legitimate male heir. The years of hope had turned into decades of disappointment, and with every stillbirth and miscarriage, the dreams once bound to a golden cradle in Richmond faded further into desperation. The Queen, Catherine of Aragon, now in her 40s, aged beyond her years by grief and repeated pregnancies, remained devout, obedient, and unyielding in her sense of duty. But Henry, driven by dynastic anxiety and spiritual doubt, began to question whether his marriage itself was cursed. He clung to a passage from Leviticus. If a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. They shall be childless, and convinced himself that God had closed Catherine's womb because of the sin of their union. It was in this fevered theological and emotional environment that Anne Boleyn emerged, not merely as a courtly distraction, but as a force destined to upend centuries of religious and political tradition. Young, intelligent, and fiercely ambitious, Anne did not offer herself as a mistress. She offered herself as a solution. To Henry, she was the promise of redemption, of renewal, of restoration. Her refusal to be simply another consort inflamed his passion and deepened his determination. By 1527, Henry had resolved to annul his marriage to Catherine and make Anne his queen. But such a decision required papal approval, and the Pope, trapped between spiritual authority and political allegiance to Catherine's nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, refused to grant it. And so the king, who had once been called fidei defensor, defender of the faith, turned against the very institution he had pledged to uphold. What followed was not merely a personal rebellion. It was a national rupture. Henry challenged the Pope's authority in England, dismissed Rome's legal supremacy, and declared himself head of the Church of England. The Act of Supremacy in 1534 marked the formal break with Rome, but the real breach had come long before, in the silence of a royal nursery and the empty arms of a grieving monarch. Henry's love for Anne, once pure and consuming, became entangled with politics, theology, and paranoia. She had promised him a son, and in 1533, she gave birth to a child, Elizabeth. Though healthy and intelligent, the child was not the male heir Henry had sacrificed everything for. The disappointment was profound. The tension between Anne and Henry grew rapidly. Multiple pregnancies ended in miscarriage, and Anne's political enemies multiplied. In 1536, just months after suffering another miscarriage, reportedly of a male child, Anne was arrested, charged with adultery, incest, and treason. Her execution at the Tower of London shocked the world. The woman for whom Henry had changed the face of Christianity was now discarded, beheaded, and erased from official memory. Yet her daughter, the infant Elizabeth, would one day become one of the most powerful monarchs in English history. But in that moment, it seemed the tragedy of Prince Henry's death had repeated itself. Once again, a child had not survived. Once again, a queen had fallen. Once again, Henry was alone with his obsession. And the kingdom he ruled had become unrecognizable. Monasteries were destroyed, altars desecrated, thousands of monks, priests, and nuns turned out of their sacred homes. England bled its faith upon the altar of Henry's dynastic insecurity. Thomas More, the king's once trusted chancellor and conscience, refused to acknowledge the supremacy of the crown over the church and paid with his life. Fisher, Bishop of Rochester, followed him to the scaffold. The Tower of London, once a symbol of royal justice, now became a chamber of horrors for those who defied the will of a man still haunted by the death of his son. And all of it, the divorce, the executions, the religious schism, had its roots in that moment in 1511 when a newborn prince closed his eyes for the final time. Henry's future was meant to rest in that child. But robbed of his heir, the king instead turned his kingdom into a weapon. The Church of England was born not from a doctrinal revolution, but from the broken heart of a father who could not accept God's silence. And the woman who had promised him peace gave him only more turmoil. Anne Boleyn's rise and fall were not anomalies. They were echoes of the same tragedy, reverberating through a court that had never truly healed. In every law Henry passed, in every chapel he seized, and in every noble he condemned, there was a quiet, unspoken voice behind it all. The voice of the child who never ruled, but who changed everything. As the 1530s gave way to the 1540s, Henry VIII no longer resembled the athletic prince who had once danced through the courts of Europe, dazzling foreign envoys with his intellect, charm, and strength. The death of Prince Henry Tudor had set in motion a slow transformation, not only of England, but of the king himself. Now in his 50s, grossly overweight, plagued by festering leg ulcers, and prone to explosive rages, Henry had become a monarch feared by all who served him. The joy that once radiated from his eyes when holding his newborn son had long vanished. In its place was a cold, calculating stare, the gaze of a man whose paranoia had been forged in grief and hardened by betrayal. His court remained a theater of masks, where courtiers smiled as they plotted, and where every shadow might conceal a traitor. After Anne Boleyn's death, Henry married 4 more times, each marriage a desperate attempt to replace the son he had lost. Jane Seymour, his 3rd wife, gave birth to Edward in 1537, a male heir at last, but died shortly after. Her death, though tragic, earned her a special place in Henry's heart as the only wife who gave him what he had yearned for. Yet even Edward's birth did not undo the damage already done. The kingdom had been reshaped in Prince Henry's absence, molded by the ruthless efforts of a father who would do anything to prevent such a loss from ever happening again. The dissolution of the monasteries continued, destroying centuries of tradition and stripping the church of its lands, wealth, and authority. Thousands of monks, friars, and nuns were left homeless or executed, and vast treasures vanished into the royal coffers. Religious icons were smashed, shrines to saints were demolished. Even the tomb of Thomas Becket, England's beloved martyr, was desecrated. Henry's rule became defined by brutality cloaked in divine justification. Every challenge to his authority, be it religious dissent, courtly intrigue, or even private criticism, was met with swift and often gruesome punishment. Loyal servants fell like leaves in autumn. Thomas Cromwell, architect of the English Reformation, was executed after falling from royal favor. The Countess of Salisbury, an old woman and cousin to the king, was beheaded after refusing to betray her family. The law no longer protected the innocent, it merely carried out the king's fears. And yet, behind each decree, each blade, each act of tyranny, the cause could be traced back to the failure of succession. The death of a child had created a king obsessed with control, terrified of weakness, and willing to reshape his entire nation to ensure that the past did not repeat itself. But it did. Edward VI, born in joy and raised in cloistered privilege, would only rule for 6 short years before dying at age 15, plunging the realm once again into uncertainty. The irony was cruel. In his relentless pursuit of a male heir to secure the Tudor legacy, Henry had destroyed the very stability he sought to preserve. After Edward's death, England fell into chaos. Competing claims to the throne emerged. The tragic Lady Jane Grey was queen for just 9 days before being deposed by Mary, Catherine's daughter, the same daughter Henry had once deemed illegitimate. Mary's reign brought a brief return to Catholicism, but her fiery persecution of Protestants earned her the name, Bloody Mary. And after her death, the crown passed to Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter, the daughter Henry had never wanted, never expected to rule, and once declared a bastard. The irony of it all would have been unthinkable to the court in 1511. The 2 girls Henry had tried to set aside had inherited the very throne he fought so desperately to preserve for a son. Yet even Elizabeth's long and glorious reign could not fully erase the trail of suffering that led to her crown. It had been paved with executions, burnings, broken vows, and broken hearts. And it had all begun with the death of a single child, Henry Tudor, the prince who never ruled. His tiny heartbeat had stopped, but the echoes had never ceased. In the stories told around hearths, in the prayers whispered in ruined abbeys, in the silence of unmarked graves, his absence remained. No monument bore his legacy. No sword was ever raised in his name. And yet he had shaped a kingdom. He had transformed a king. The boy who lived just 52 days had, in many ways, ruled for decades, not by power, but by absence. And the father who had loved him, mourned him, and then tried to replace him had become a symbol of both renaissance and ruin. The nation Henry left behind was fractured, richer, perhaps, and more powerful, but divided in faith, wounded in spirit, and uncertain of its soul. It had become a kingdom whose path had been forever altered not by the choices of men, but by the death of a child who never got to choose. Centuries have passed since that cold February in 1511 when bells tolled for a lost prince and black cloth draped the streets of London. Time has dulled the immediacy of that grief, burying it beneath layers of history, scholarship, and changing memory. But the death of Prince Henry Tudor was never just the loss of a child. It was the axis upon which England's destiny turned. Without that loss, there may have been no break from Rome, no Elizabethan Golden Age, no centuries of religious warfare and national rebirth. His death was not an isolated tragedy, it was a pivot. And it shaped kings, queens, policies, and people in ways that even now ripple through the pages of history. Historians often overlook him, treating him as a footnote, a child born and buried without ever knowing the burden of rule. But that simplicity masks the depth of his significance. For it was his death that revealed the instability at the heart of the Tudor claim. It was his death that turned Henry VIII from a Renaissance prince into a paranoid tyrant, a man who saw threats where there were none, who struck before others could even raise their voices. Without the security of a male heir, Henry unraveled. The executions, the marriages, the excommunications, they were all responses to a terror that began at a small funeral in Westminster Abbey. And the consequences reached far beyond one reign. The vacuum left by Prince Henry shaped not just Henry VIII's actions but the succession crisis that followed. Edward VI's short reign, Mary I's bloody counter-reformation, and Elizabeth I's eventual triumph were all chapters in a story that began with the death of a baby too young to speak. Even beyond the Tudors, the legacy endured. England's eventual embrace of Protestantism, its isolation from European Catholic powers, and its identity as a seafaring, reformist nation all trace back, in some part, to that moment of loss. The English monarchy itself was altered. Future kings and queens bore the scars of Henry VIII's desperation. They inherited a monarchy that was both more powerful and more precarious, one that had broken old alliances, rewritten sacred laws, and made the throne as much a place of danger as of glory. And yet, for all the violence, all the upheaval, the story of Prince Henry also offers a quiet counter-narrative, a reminder of the fragile humanity at the heart of power. Behind every proclamation, behind every battle or political act, there is always a beating heart, a grieving parent, a family fractured by fate. The grandeur of royalty often conceals the simple truth that even kings break. Henry VIII, who changed the world, was once just a father standing beside a coffin, his dreams buried with a tiny crown. It is easy to think of history as battles and treaties, revolutions and reformations. But sometimes, history turns on softer things, on whispers in corridors, on tears shed in private, on the unbearable silence of a nursery left empty. Prince Henry's death was such a turning point. He never wore the crown, never rode to war, never issued a decree. And yet, his influence is everywhere. In the broken altars, in the crowned queens once deemed illegitimate, in the church services sung in English, in the pride and paranoia that still echo through the halls of Westminster. Perhaps that is the final paradox. The most influential Tudor king never ruled at all. His tiny life, measured in days not decades, burned briefly and brightly enough to cast shadows across centuries. In the memory of his father, he was perfect, a dream, an heir, a future. In the memory of his nation, he was a spark that lit a fire too great to control. His tomb, though silent, speaks volumes. And though his name is not often spoken, the echoes of his absence still shape the stories we tell of England's past. The bells that rang out for his death were not just tolls of mourning, they were warnings. Warnings of what power becomes when touched by grief. Warnings of what history becomes when a single life is lost. In Prince Henry's absence, an empire was remade, a church was broken, a king was undone. And history, forever altered, marched forward beneath the shadow of a child. You've just witnessed one of the darkest punishments in history. But many more still lurk in the shadows. So if you dare, subscribe to Torture Vault. where every scream from the past still echoes.